Well, let's talk then to our international affairs commentator, Doug Herbert, who joins us now. Doug, the protesters here perhaps going for broke, if you like, a bit of a going for broke mentality. They feel they have nothing to lose, despite the great risks to life and limb.
Absolutely, Stuart. Look, this is a new generation of young protesters. It's a very young country. A lot of these people, obviously out on the streets right now, have no memories of the brutal crackdown on the 1988, over 30 years ago, student uprising in which thousands were killed after momentous protests that sort of grew and mushroomed in the same way that we're seeing now. Look, the fact of the matter is there has been Myanmar. It has had its 10-year transition to democracy, as we keep saying, brutally disrupted, put ground to a halt by this military coup. These were people who were in the midst of sort of building lives, had a lot of dreams, had, projects for the future. And you wake up one morning and suddenly you find it's not only on hold, but all of those dreams are essentially snuffed out by the writ of a military junta that you thought was sort of had, sidelined itself in favor of a civilian leadership. So these protesters basically, these protests are going to grow. The civil disobedience looks like it's going to grow. As you said, despite the obvious risks, these people aren't dumb. They know their country's recent history. They know that this is a military and its security forces who will perhaps stop at nothing in order to quell dissent, as we've been seeing over this past weekend, past few days. The death of this first young protester who had been shot in the head on February 9th and then had been on life support ever since. Her death last Friday has really given new impotence to these protests. They now have martyrs. They now have people for whom they believe they need to carry out this struggle. And you're absolutely right. I mean, they basically feel that they have absolutely nothing to lose, this go-for-broke attitude in trying to restore democracy that they think has been very hard-earned in their country and which was just snatched away from them completely unjustly and against all norms of international law. So they are going to hang on right now. And it's right now a war of attrition in the battle of wills.
Yeah, let's talk a bit more about the military then, Doug. I mean, do you think they're in any kind of mood to concede?
No, they're not. Look, they're obviously, they may have believed that their show of force early on in dispersing these protesters using water cannons, using rubber bullets, using slingshots, using tear gas, and now also live ammunition, they may have thought that it would have been enough to intimidate, to bully the protesters into submission, get them off the streets, and get those workers, the civil servants, the factory workers, the railway workers, the shipyard workers, the ones that the army desperately needs to keep the country running. They might have thought it would have been enough to sort of stamp it all out. Well, it hasn't been. But then again, this is a military that has really been brought up in its own sort of mindset, its own world view. And it really doesn't give a hoot, to put it mildly, what the international community thinks. Doubly so because it has, for now at least, China and Russia on its side. Perhaps not full-fledged support for the violence. China and Russia are not condoning the brutal crackdown, but they do know that when push comes to shove on the international stage, in the multinational forums, Stuart, such as the United Nations Security Council, China has the military junta's back, as does Russia. And as long as those two very influential powers really are there, along with some other neighbors in the region who have a lot of economic interests in Myanmar, the military probably feels like it will have just enough wind in its sails, so to speak, diplomatically speaking, in order to remain in power, to stay in power against flouting the will of Western powers, and including, the United Nations General Secretary, who has roundly condemned this violence and called for the release of Aung San Suu Kyi, the civilian leader who's been deposed. So military is going to cling on. I don't see them going quietly into the night.
Doug, thanks very much. Doug Herbert, international affairs commentator here on France 24.